So imagine spending your entire lifetime just meticulously climbing to the absolute pinnacle of a nation's power structure.
Right. Decades of work.
Exactly. You spend decades outmaneuvering rivals, silencing any dissent, and really just consolidating authority until you are the chosen successor.
The heir apparent, basically, to this massive ideological system.
Yeah. And then, in a split second, that entire grand design, all those decades of political engineering, it's just completely undone by a patch of thick fog on a rugged mountainside.
It's really the ultimate collision between absolute human control and just the unpredictable forces of nature.
It really is.
Like the state builds this perfect, hermetically sealed bubble of authority, and the weather just comes along and pops it.
It's wild. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tracing the complete, incredibly complex biography of Ebrahim Raisi, Iran's 8th president.
We're following his whole trajectory, right?
Right. From his beginnings in the religious center of Mashhad all the way to that sudden, shocking death in the 2024 helicopter crash. And for you listening, we're drawing on a massive stack of sources for this.
Oh, yeah, it's a lot to get through.
It is. We've got comprehensive biographical data, detailed timelines of the Varzakhan helicopter crash, and some really intense human rights investigations by Amnesty International.
Plus, we're looking at geopolitical analyses from places like the Hudson Institute, the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, and the Iran Primer.
Yeah. And, looking at all that material, you realize pretty quickly that we can't just outline who this man was.
No, you really have to dissect the actual machinery of the Iranian political system that propelled him upward.
Exactly. And of course, analyze the massive geopolitical void his abrupt exit leaves in the Middle East. But before we get deep into this timeline, I do want to set a firm boundary for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's important.
The sources we're utilizing today, they contain highly charged political content and accounts of severe systemic violence.
Really heavy stuff.
Right. So our objective here is not to endorse any specific viewpoint, justify state actions, or take a political side. Not at all.
We're taking an entirely impartial approach.
Exactly. We're just unpacking the facts, the history, and the perspectives exactly as they are documented in the sources. We have to look objectively at the environment that created him.
And that environment begins at the absolute spiritual heart of Iran. Ebrahim Raisi was born on December 14th, 1960, in Mashhad.
Which is a pretty crucial location.
Very. It's home to the Reza Shrine. So growing up in a clerical family in that deeply religious, conservative environment, it charts a very specific course.
Right. It sets the stage.
Yeah. And he loses his father, a cleric, when he's just 5 years old. Then, by 1975, when he's 15, he travels to Qom.
That's like the theological epicenter of Shia Islam, yeah.
Exactly. He goes there to begin his clerical studies at the Qom Seminary.
Okay, so the timing of his arrival in Qom seems like the first major variable in his ascent.
Oh, absolutely. The mid-1970s in Iran is just a pressure cooker.
Right. The political temperature against the Shah is rising rapidly.
Yeah. And by the time the 1979 Iranian Revolution overthrows the monarchy and establishes the Islamic Republic, Raisi is a 19-year-old student immersed entirely in this revolutionary religious fervor.
So he's right in the middle of it.
He is. And the 1979 revolution acts as the defining crucible for his entire generation. When the new regime, led by Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, takes over, they don't just, change the leadership.
Dismantle everything, right?
Completely. They dismantle the whole state apparatus. They purge the old guard, the secular judges, the military officers, the bureaucrats.
Which creates a massive power vacuum.
Unprecedented. At every single level of governance, there's just this huge void.
And that actually leads to a detail in the sources that we really need to unpack. Because by 1981, Ebrahim Raisi is 21 years old.
Barely out of his teens.
Right. And he's simultaneously appointed as the prosecutor of 2 different cities, Karaj and Hamadan.
Which is wild.
Yeah, especially when you realize those 2 cities are roughly 300 kilometers apart.
Yeah, just logistically, it makes no sense.
Exactly. For anyone following this, imagine a 21-year-old being handed the keys to the district attorney's office in 2 major geographically distant cities simultaneously.
It's an anomaly, for sure.
So how does someone so young and inexperienced consolidate that much legal power so fast? What does it actually mean when the legal code is handed over to someone whose education is almost entirely in revolutionary theology?
Well, it basically means civil law ceases to exist in the traditional sense.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You're moving from a system based on precedent and codified statutes to one based purely on ideological purity and theological interpretation.
So they weren't looking for legal experts.
Not at all. The post-1979 regime was in pure survival mode. They faced massive internal opposition, and soon after, that devastating 8-year war with Iraq.
Right, the Iran-Iraq War.
Exactly. So they didn't have the luxury of time to train a new generation of seasoned legal scholars. The traditional requirements, age, experience, legal distance, they were completely discarded.
They just needed loyalists.
Yeah. The Islamic Republic needed this cadre of deeply loyal youth who would just execute the will of the supreme leader without hesitation or, legal pedantry.
So they needed enforcers, not philosophers.
Precisely. And Raisi fit the profile perfectly. He was a student of prominent revolutionary figures, and he demonstrated an absolute commitment to the new system.
He was willing to be that blunt instrument.
Yeah, exactly. The blunt instrument the state required during its most vulnerable infancy.
But looking at the sources, it seems like his lack of formal academic and religious credentials actually became a pretty severe vulnerability later on in his career.
Oh, definitely. He engaged in quite a bit of smoke and mirrors regarding his titles.
Yeah, I read about that. He claimed on his official website to have a doctorate, right?
Yeah, doctorate in private law. And he also started referring to himself using the highly prestigious clerical title of Ayatollah.
But that wasn't exactly true.
No. Independent analysts and Iranian media scrutinized his background and found a stark lack of advanced religious and academic training to actually justify those titles.
So he was basically padding a resume that couldn't hold up to public scrutiny.
Exactly. And the domestic pushback actually forced his hand. He had to downgrade his own title on his website to Hojat ol-Islam, which is a clerical rank immediately beneath Ayatollah.
But then, right before his run for the presidency in 2021, didn't he suddenly declare himself an Ayatollah again?
He did. He needed the religious weight for the campaign, so he just reclaimed the title.
That's a fascinating political calculation, though it is telling that when Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei officially appointed him as president, Khamenei pointedly still referred to him as a Hojat al-Islam.
Right, putting him in his place a bit.
Yeah, it really illustrates how fluid and politically weaponized these titles can be.
Absolutely.
So this fast-tracked regional prosecutor doesn't stay in the provinces for long, right? Because in 1985, he's moved to the capital, becoming the deputy prosecutor of Tehran.
Which positions him right at the epicenter of a period in 1988 that would entirely define his legacy.
Right, this is where he earns that terrifying moniker. The summer of 1988, it represents one of the darkest chapters in modern Iranian history, according to the sources.
And the geopolitical context is so vital here. The grueling, brutal Iran-Iraq war was finally coming to a bitter end.
But just as the ceasefire was taking hold, things escalated internally again.
Yeah, an outlawed Iranian opposition group known as the PMOI, the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, they launched an armed incursion into Iran from their base in Iraq.
The regime repelled the attack, but it seems like the psychological damage was done. The state apparatus experienced this intense wave of paranoia.
Massive paranoia. So in late July 1988, Supreme Leader Khomeini issued a secret fatwa, or religious ruling.
Ordering the execution of political prisoners?
Yeah, ordering the execution of prisoners across the country who remained loyal to the PMOI and other leftist factions.
And the Amnesty International investigations provide a pretty harrowing breakdown of how this was actually orchestrated.
It was a massive logistical undertaking. Suddenly, prisons across Iran went into complete lockdown.
Just totally cut off from the outside world.
Exactly. Family visits were suspended without a word of explanation. Televisions and radios were physically stripped from the cells. The prisoners were plunged into a total information blackout.
But here's what I want to ask for anyone listening who lives in a country with, a standard legal appeals process or even just basic bureaucratic transparency. It's almost impossible to comprehend the scale of this secrecy.
It's staggering.
If the prisons were locked down and this was done in secret, how did organizations like Amnesty actually piece together such a detailed account?
Well, you can't disappear thousands of people without the logistical seams showing.
Right. There's always a trail.
Yeah. The Amnesty reports were painstakingly built over years. They relied on corroborating the testimonies of the tiny fraction of prisoners who actually survived, and cross-referencing those with accounts from low-level prison guards who defected later on.
And the families too, right?
Yes. They documented the deeply traumatic patterns experienced by the families. Families would be given conflicting information for months.
Just left in the dark.
And then, suddenly, they'd be handed a plastic bag with their loved one's belongings and explicitly ordered not to hold a mourning ceremony.
God. And the sources mention specific survivors, like Mohammad Reza Asho, who actually survived by physically escaping while en route to a firing squad.
Yeah, his account was crucial.
Through those accounts, you really see the systemic, almost industrialized nature of the killings. This wasn't a chaotic riot. Khomeini mandated special panels, informally dubbed death commissions.
And in Tehran, this commission was a four-man panel. Ebrahim Raisi, as the deputy prosecutor of Tehran, sat on that panel.
So he was right there in the room.
He was. And the term trial really does not apply here,
No, from what the reports say, they were more like rapid-fire interrogations.
lasting merely minutes. Prisoners, many of whom had already served their sentences or were incarcerated for nonviolent acts like distributing pamphlets, were brought before the commission blindfolded.
And they had no idea they were fighting for their lives.
None. The panel asked purely ideological questions. Are you willing to condemn your former political groups? Do you repent? Are you willing to clear minefields for the Islamic Republic?
And the penalty for the wrong answer was immediate execution.
Immediate.
The amnesty reports detail the horrific mechanics the state had to employ to handle the sheer volume of executions. The prison infrastructure was just completely overwhelmed.
It was. They resorted to loading prisoners onto forklift trucks in groups of 6 and hanging them from cranes in half-hour intervals.
And again, families were kept entirely in the dark. The victims were buried in unmarked mass graves like that abandoned area known as Kavaran in southeast Tehran.
Yeah. And the estimates of the death toll, they range from 4,500 to as high as 30,000.
That's just an unfathomable number. Now, while the regime attempted to maintain this strict wall of silence, the sources show that the most damning evidence actually came from the highest echelons of the Islamic Republic itself.
Yeah, this is where it gets really complicated internally.
We're talking about the leaked audio tape from Hossein Ali Montazeri, right?
Exactly. In 1988, Ayatollah Montazeri was the deputy supreme leader. He was Khomeini's hand-picked, designated successor.
So he was next in line for the top job.
Right. But he was fundamentally appalled by the scale and the brutality of these massacres. So in August 1988, he summoned the 4 members of the Tehran Death Commission, including Raisi, to a secret meeting.
To demand an immediate halt to the executions.
Yes. And decades later, in 2016, the audio of that exact meeting was leaked. It is an extraordinary historical artifact.
You can actually hear Montazeri speaking directly to Raisi and the other commissioners.
You can, he says. The greatest atrocity in the Islamic Republic, for which history will condemn us, has been committed at your hands, and in future your names will go down in history as criminals.
That is incredibly direct. And you also hear the commission members arguing back, right?
Yeah, they offer these bureaucratic excuses, claiming they're merely trying to finish processing the remaining prisoners they'd already isolated in solitary confinement.
Just pushing papers, basically.
That was the defense. But Montazeri's defiance was absolute, and it cost him everything. He was stripped of his successor status, placed under permanent house arrest, and effectively erased from the regime's official narrative.
Wow. Now, we have to present Raisi's defense impartially, based on the documented history. How did he rationalize his role in this when his political profile grew and he was forced to address it publicly around 2018?
Well, he didn't deny being in that room with Montazeri,
Hey.
but he deflected the specific legal responsibility while simultaneously embracing the outcome. He argued that he was merely the prosecutor, a representative of the people, and that the ultimate legal burden of sentencing falls on the head of the court, the judge.
So it's a defense reliant entirely on bureaucratic compartmentalization.
Exactly that. However, he did not distance himself from the executions themselves. Using coded language about the confrontation with opposition groups, he publicly praised the executions as one of the proud achievements of the system.
He actually lauded Khomeini as a national hero for issuing the fatwa.
He did.
And that unwavering defense is really what cemented his reputation globally. Western media, human rights groups, Iranian opposition circles, they all universally adopted the moniker, the Butcher of Tehran.
But internally, within the power structures of the Islamic Republic, his actions in 1988 served a completely different function.
It proved his loyalty.
Absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He demonstrated a willingness to carry out the regime's darkest, most controversial directives without flinching.
Which is the most valuable currency in an authoritarian system preparing for a leadership transition. Because following Khomeini's death in 1989, Ali Khamenei becomes the new supreme leader.
And Khamenei requires operators like Raisi to secure his new administration.
So we see this steady, methodical consolidation of power. Khamenei rewards Raisi with a succession of really heavy-hitting judicial roles.
Yeah, he's the Tehran prosecutor from 1989 to 1994, then head of the General Inspection Office.
And then for a full decade, from 2004 to 2014, he serves as the first Deputy Chief Justice of Iran.
He is embedding himself deep within the nervous system of the state.
But the pivotal moment, the elevation from a powerful insider to a massive public heavyweight that occurs in 2016 when Khamenei appoints Raisi as the custodian of Astan Quds-Razavi.
Yeah, this is a huge turning point.
Let's pause and dissect Astan Quds-Razavi. Because to an outside observer, being appointed the head of a religious charity does not sound like a launch pad to the presidency.
No, it sounds like a retirement gig.
Right. But in the Iranian system, a boneyard operates on a completely different frequency. Can you explain the shadow economy of a boneyard?
Sure. So a bunyad translates to a charitable foundation or trust. However, in post-revolutionary Iran, these entities absorb the seized assets of the former monarchy and its elites.
Ah, so they have deep pockets.
Unbelievably deep. They function as massive, tax-exempt economic conglomerates that answer exclusively to the supreme leader. They exist entirely outside of the standard government budget and parliamentary oversight.
So they're completely opaque.
Entirely. And Astan Quds-Razavi is arguably the most powerful of them all. It manages the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, which receives millions of pilgrims annually.
But it goes far beyond a shrine, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. They control a vast, diversified empire. We are talking about prime real estate development, manufacturing facilities, massive agricultural holdings, and their own financial institutions.
So it's comparable to being handed executive control of a mega corporation, a massive hedge fund, and a holy site simultaneously.
Exactly. It provided Raisi with an independent financial power base and immense patronage capabilities. He could award contracts, create jobs, and build a loyal constituency entirely independent of the elected government.
That financial autonomy made him practically untouchable.
It really did. And Khamenei compounded that power in 2019 by appointing Raisi as the Chief Justice of Iran.
Now, the Hudson Institute analysis frames this specific promotion as part of Khamenei's long-term purification project.
Right.
And I want to use a different metaphor here rather than a chess game. The Iranian political system under Khamenei looks less like a chessboard and more like a heavily curated walled garden.
I like that.
Khamenei is the gardener. He recognizes the moderate and reformist factions are growing too influential, maybe too intertwined with the West. So he selectively introduces an aggressive, invasive species, Raisi, and the hardline judiciary to systematically choke out the native moderates.
That is an incredibly accurate way to view the dynamic. Khamenei was initiating what he called the second step of the Islamic Revolution.
Because the first generation was aging out.
Right. To secure his legacy, he needed to purge the state apparatus of pragmatists and inject a new cadre of highly indoctrinated, fiercely loyal hardliners into every lever of power. And as Chief Justice, Raisi was the mechanism for that purge.
He weaponized the judiciary under the highly popular guise of an anti-corruption campaign. How exactly did he utilize that mandate to eliminate his rivals?
He was very methodical. He targeted the power bases of his most potent competitors. For example, he oversaw the arrest and prosecution of a top deputy to his predecessor, Sadegh Molli Larijani.
And Larijani was a prominent cleric, right? Of a potential rival for the supreme leadership.
Exactly. So by taking down Larijani's right-hand man on corruption charges, Raisi severely kneecapped Larijani's faction without having to attack the man directly.
That's incredibly strategic. And he targeted the moderate faction directly, too, didn't he?
He did. He convicted the brother of the sitting moderate president, Hassan Rouhani, and sent him to prison on corruption charges.
So he's literally using the legal code to prune the political tree.
Yeah. And concurrently, the sources note, he utilized this period to bring in commanders from the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to expand their control over the economy.
He essentially formed a symbiotic alliance with the hardline military apparatus. He allowed IRGC-affiliated companies to secure massive state contracts, proving that he would protect their economic monopolies above all else.
And by neutralizing the moderates and aligning with the military, the path was completely cleared for the presidency.
Which brings us to the actual electoral mechanics. His path to the presidency wasn't an unbroken ascent. He ran in 2017 and suffered a decisive defeat against the moderate incumbent, Hassan Rouhani.
The electorate split roughly 38% for Raisi to 57% for Rouhani.
Because in 2017, a viable moderate coalition still existed in Iran, driven by the hope of the nuclear deal and economic integration. Raisi represented isolation, and the voters rejected it.
But, fast forward 4 years to 2021, and the entire landscape has degraded.
Yeah, the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal, crushing sanctions were reimposed, the economy was in a tailspin, and the public was just exhausted.
So Raisi runs again and secures a staggering 62% of the vote.
But every geopolitical analysis in our source stack attaches a massive asterisk to that victory.
A huge asterisk. Because it was completely engineered by the Guardian Council.
Let's break down exactly how the Guardian Council manipulates an election before a single ballot is even cast.
So the Guardian Council is this unelected body of clerics and jurists heavily influenced by the supreme leader. They possess the constitutional authority to vet and disqualify any political candidate.
Basically a giant filter?
Right. And for the 2021 election, they didn't just filter the candidates, they completely decimated the field. They disqualified virtually every single credible rival to Raisi.
Moderates, reformists, they all got the boot.
Crucially, they even disqualified other hardliners who might fracture Raisi's voting bloc. Guys like former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and former Parliament Speaker Ali Larijani.
They created a vacuum by administrative decree. When the electorate realized the race was a foregone conclusion, the resulting voter apathy triggered the lowest turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, Raisi wasn't carried into office on a wave of popular mandate. He was installed via systemic manipulation.
But for Supreme Leader Khamenei, that lack of popular mandate was irrelevant, wasn't it?
Totally irrelevant. The objective was ideological alignment. Raisi's presidency marked the first time in post-Khomeini Iran that the executive branch was perfectly, seamlessly aligned with the supreme leader's vision.
The concept of Velayat-e-Faqih, or guardianship of the Islamic jurists.
Right. The state was unified under a singular, uncompromising hardline mandate.
So we arrive at his presidency. He inherits a nation of 80 million people buckling under intense Western sanctions, suffering from severe inflation, and a populace simmering with unrest. How does a hardliner govern a country in a state of permanent economic crisis?
The regime relies heavily on the concept of a resistance economy.
I want to get into the weeds on this. What are the actual underground financial mechanisms of a resistance economy? How do you bypass global financial systems like SWIFT?
The resistance economy is fundamentally the institutionalization of sanctions evasion. When you cannot access SWIFT to process international bank transfers, and you can't legally sell your primary export oil, you have to build an entire shadow infrastructure.
Like the Ghost Armada mentioned in the sources.
Yes. Iran utilizes a massive fleet of aging, often unregistered oil tankers that turn off their AI's tracking transponders to smuggle crude oil, primarily to independent refineries in China.
And how does the money actually flow back if the banks are locked?
They rely heavily on regional hawala networks.
Which is an ancient trust-based system of money transfer, right?
Oh. Yeah, it operates entirely outside of traditional banking regulations. It moves value across borders through brokers without physically moving the cash or leaving a digital paper trail.
Fascinating.
Furthermore, the resistance economy mandates an intense, forced focus on domestic manufacturing to replace blocked imports.
But doesn't that create a paradox? How do you manufacture complex goods domestically when you're starved of the advanced form components required to build the factories?
That's exactly the problem. It results in a highly inefficient, inflation-prone internal market.
So while he's attempting to manage this fractured economy, he is simultaneously overseeing some of the most brutal domestic crackdowns in recent Iranian history.
Late 2022 sees the eruption of the Mahsa Amini protests.
Young people are taking to the streets, women are removing their hijabs, and the demands escalate from social reform to the complete dissolution of the Islamic Republic.
And the state's response under Raisi is absolute force.
Raisi's administration didn't view the protests as a grievance to be managed. They viewed them as a security threat to be eradicated. His government intensified the deployment of security forces with lethal intent.
But what is really highly notable during this period is the evolution of their digital authoritarianism.
The implementation of the internet blackouts, how did they execute that technically?
They accelerated the deployment of the National Information Network. This is effectively a state-controlled intranet designed to eventually replace the global internet within Iran's borders.
So they can just pull the plug on the outside world.
Right. During the height of the protests, the government possessed the technical capability to throttle bandwidth to a crawl, block major social media platforms like Instagram and WhatsApp, and plunge entire provinces into digital darkness.
which prevented protesters from organizing logistically.
And, crucially, stopped footage of state violence from reaching the outside world.
The sources also detail how the morality police altered their tactics under his direct mandate. It wasn't just physical patrols anymore, was it?
No, they modernized the oppression. They began utilizing traffic cameras and new facial recognition technologies to identify women violating the mandatory hijab laws in public spaces or inside their vehicles.
And then what?
Well, once identified, the state wouldn't necessarily arrest them on the street. Instead, they would systematically freeze their bank accounts, impound their cars, or shutter the businesses that allowed them entry.
It was an administrative strangulation of civil liberties.
Exactly.
Now, this domestic ruthlessness mirrors his foreign policy, which our sources categorize as pragmatic revolutionism. But I have to push back on the term pragmatic.
How so?
Well, he completely abandons the Rouhani-era pursuit of the nuclear deal and pivots aggressively to the east. He deepens ties with China, which brokers a detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
All right.
But he also transitions the relationship with Russia into direct military support, supplying Moscow with drones for its invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, Shahed drones.
Furthermore, he maintains a fiercely aggressive posture against Israel, denouncing the Abraham Accords and massively funding proxy militant groups. How is risking a direct confrontation with Israel or NATO by arming proxies and Russia considered pragmatic? That sounds inherently reckless.
I get that, but it is pragmatic only within the specific ideological framework of the Islamic Republic.
Okay, unpack that. Raisi and Khamenei operated on the fundamental belief that the U.S.-led global order was in terminal decline, and that the future of global power was shifting toward the Eurasian autocracies.
So they're betting on a new world order.
Right. By arming Russia and securing Chinese economic lifelines, Iran was making a calculated bet on a multipolar world where Western sanctions lose their bite.
And the proxy wars.
The aggression against Israel and the arming of proxies like Hezbollah or the Houthis is viewed as forward defense. The regime believes that fighting its enemies via proxies in Lebanon, Yemen, or Syria prevents those enemies from attacking Iranian soil directly.
In their calculus, it's a pragmatic strategy for regime survival, regardless of the regional destabilization it causes.
But even a hardline strategy encounters geographical realities it cannot control. The sources highlight a highly specific regional constraint Raisi faced in the South Caucasus. This really illustrates the limits of Iranian power. What exactly shifted in the Caucasus that forced Raisi to play a weaker hand?
The geopolitical balance in the South Caucasus was radically upended following the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Right.
Following that conflict, Russia and Turkey formed a tacit alliance that heavily favored Azerbaijan. Turkey, a NATO member, and Russia, Iran's supposed strategic partner, were suddenly cooperating to reshape the regional transit map.
They're attempting to establish the Zangezur corridor.
Exactly. The Zangezur corridor is a proposed transport route that would link Turkey directly to Azerbaijan via the Caspian Sea and into Central Asia.
Effectively bypassing Iranian territory entirely.
Yeah. This is a massive threat to Iran. It cuts them out of lucrative transit fees and diminishes their geopolitical relevance in their own northern backyard.
Now, under normal circumstances, Iran might aggressively push back against this encroachment. But their hands were tied.
Because of the crushing Western sanctions, Iran is deeply, uncomfortably reliant on its new strategic partnership with Russia. Raisi simply could not afford to antagonize Moscow over the Caucasus.
So his administration essentially had to, take a back seat and play a much weaker hand.
Yeah, they had to adopt a much more passive, accommodating stance. They had to negotiate smaller, complex gas swap deals with Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan just to maintain a baseline of influence.
It proved that despite projecting absolute strength domestically on the international chessboard, Iran was often a pawn to larger global dynamics.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the defining culmination of these intersecting dynamics. May 2024.
This is where everything converges.
Right. Raisi is firmly entrenched. He has survived the unprecedented 2022 protests through sheer force. He has pivoted the national economy toward Asia. He is widely considered the leading candidate to succeed the 85-year-old Supreme Leader Khamenei.
The state succession plan appears completely locked in place. Decades of meticulous political engineering have produced the exact result the Supreme Leadership desired.
But all of that human design is about to collide with a variable the state cannot arrest, sanction, or intimidate: the weather.
Yeah.
Let's reconstruct the timeline based on the Varzakhan crash reports. The date is May 19th, 2024. President Raisi is at the volatile Iran-Azerbaijan border. He has just concluded a meeting with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev to jointly inaugurate the Giz-Galasi Dam.
It's a fairly routine state visit, designed to project regional cooperation despite those underlying tensions we just discussed in the Caucasus.
Following the inauguration, Raisi and his senior entourage board a convoy of 3 helicopters to fly back to the city of Tabriz, where they are scheduled to inaugurate an oil refinery project.
And the specific aircraft Raisi boards is critical to the story.
It's a U.S.-made Bell 212 helicopter bearing the registration number 69207, which begs the question, how does the president of Iran end up flying in a decades-old American helicopter?
It is a direct manifestation of the sanctions regime. Iran originally acquired the specific helicopter in the early 2000s.
Really?
Yeah. However, due to decades of severe Western aviation sanctions, the Iranian civil and state aviation sectors have been entirely cut off from authorized spare parts, manufacturer maintenance, and software updates.
The Financial Times analysis highlighted how these sanctions forced the Iranian aviation industry to operate in a constant state of triage.
They're essentially flying museum pieces.
Yeah, I mean, how do you keep a complex rotorcraft airborne for decades without parts? You have to reverse engineer components without the original schematics or cannibalize parts from grounded aircraft? It introduces an immense level of systemic risk into every single state flight.
It really does. And boarding this aging Bell 212 alongside Raisi are several key figures. He is traveling with Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, the Governor General of East Azerbaijan, and the Supreme Leader's representative in East Azerbaijan, Mohammad Ali Hashem.
Including the flight crew and head of security, there are 8 people on board.
The convoy takes off around 1:000 p.m. local time.
Crucially, the day prior, the Iran Meteorological Organization had issued an orange weather warning for the precise mountainous region they were traversing, indicating severe climatic conditions that pose a high risk for aviation.
Right, and they were flying in a 3-ship formation. The head of the president's office, Ghulam Hossein Ismaili, is in one of the accompanying helicopters. He later provided a highly detailed minute-by-minute account of the flight, extensively documented in the timeline.
They are roughly 45 minutes into the journey. Walk us through the failure point.
So, according to Ismaili's debriefing, the weather conditions were actually standard for the initial leg of the flight. However, as the convoy approached the Dizmar forest region, which is this rugged, mountainous wildlife corridor, they abruptly encountered a massive, dense cloud bank.
Okay, so a wall of fog.
Yeah. The pilot of Raisi's helicopter, acting as the convoy commander, ordered the formation to immediately increase altitude to ascend above the cloud cover.
Standard operating procedure when flying VFR visual flight rules to avoid a controlled flight into terrain.
Exactly. The flanking helicopters comply and pull up. After roughly 30 seconds of flying above the cloud layer, the pilot of Ismaili's aircraft checks his visual references and realizes that Raisi's helicopter, which had been positioned in the center of the formation, is simply gone.
No radio distress call, no visual of an explosion, it just vanished into the fog.
The 2 remaining helicopters immediately circle the coordinates, attempting to establish radio contact, but receive only static. They attempt to descend below the cloud layer to initiate a visual search, but the fog is entirely opaque. They have 0 ground visibility.
Forced by the dangerous conditions, they land at the nearby Sungun copper mine to orchestrate a ground rescue.
This triggers one of the most surreal and haunting sequences in the documentation. Once grounded, the frantic officials begin dialing the cell phones of the passengers on Raisi's missing aircraft.
They call the pilot's phone, right? The call connects, but the pilot doesn't answer.
The phone is answered by Mohammad Ali Hashem, the Supreme Leader's representative. He actually survived the initial catastrophic impact.
Ismaili manages to communicate with him, and Ali Hashem's final words, as recorded in the official reports, are incredibly bleak. He states, "I don't feel good. I don't know what happened. I don't know where I am. I'm under trees. I don't know. I don't see anyone. I'm alone."
It paints a visceral picture of total systemic collapse. The state officials immediately dispatch ambulances and specialized rescue teams toward the estimated triangulation.
Remarkably, Ali Hashem remains conscious and continues to answer calls for nearly 3 hours as the rescue teams attempt to navigate the treacherous, freezing terrain blindly.
He's waiting for a state apparatus that just cannot reach him.
He ultimately succumbed to his injuries in that foggy forest before the first responders arrived. The crash site was eventually located at an altitude of 2,205 meters over 7,200 feet.
The sheer difficulty of the terrain and the 0 visibility weather rendered a rapid aerial search utterly impossible.
It necessitated a massive multinational search effort that instantly became an international political flashpoint. Iran, a state that prides itself on self-reliance and geopolitical isolation, was forced to publicly request advanced assistance.
Yeah, they asked Turkey for night vision-capable aerial assets. A Turkish Akinci drone was deployed and eventually identified a thermal anomaly that pinpointed the crash site.
Russia deployed 50 specialized mountain rescue personnel, and the European Union activated its Copernicus Rapid Response Satellite Mapping Service to aid in locating the wreckage.
Which immediately triggered a massive political uproar across Europe.
You had European parliamentarians and citizens furious that EU taxpayer resources and advanced technology were being utilized to assist in locating a man universally known in human rights circles as the Butcher of Tehran.
It perfectly encapsulates the extreme global polarization Raisi generated.
Ultimately, the charred wreckage was reached the following morning. There were no survivors.
The Iranian military immediately assumed jurisdiction over the investigation. And given the highly volatile geopolitical climate, the ongoing shadow war with Israel, the deep internal societal unrest, speculation regarding assassinations, sabotage, or electronic warfare was rampant.
If the president of a highly sanctioned, embattled autocracy dies in a sudden crash, the immediate public assumption is a missile, a bomb, or an intelligence operation.
Naturally. But the final military report released months later concluded something entirely different.
On September 1st, 2024, the Supreme Board of the General Staff of the Armed Forces released their definitive findings. What did they conclude?
They concluded unequivocally that there was no evidence of foul play, no acoustic evidence of an explosion prior to impact, no signs of sabotage on the recovered wreckage, and no indication of electronic warfare disrupting the navigation systems.
So no conspiracy.
None. The accident was determined to be purely climatic. A sudden, impenetrable wall of fog caused the pilot to lose spatial orientation, resulting in a high-speed controlled flight into the mountain terrain.
A climatic anomaly. An ancient geographic hazard. And the entire trajectory of the nation is shattered, which plunges us into the aftermath and the massive, destabilizing succession void this creates.
The sudden death of a head of state is a crisis anywhere. But in a highly engineered authoritarian system like Iran, where the leadership has spent years actively eliminating alternative candidates to favor this specific individual, it generates an absolute earthquake.
This system was completely shocked. Raisi is only the second Iranian president to die in office, right?
Yeah, the first being Mohammad Ali Rajai, who was assassinated in a bombing in 1981 during the chaotic early years of the revolution.
The Constitution mandated an immediate transition. First Vice President Mohammad Mokbar was elevated to acting president, triggering a strict 50-day countdown to organize and execute a new national presidential election.
And the domestic reaction to his death laid bare the unhealable, deep-seated fractures within Iranian society. The state declared 5 days of mandatory national mourning. State media broadcast endless footage of tens of thousands of loyalists weeping in the streets of Tehran and Mashhad, mourning a martyred leader.
But that was a highly curated narrative. The reality on the ground, documented extensively by independent journalists and citizen networks on social media, showed a starkly divided nation.
Videos circulated globally, showing Iranians in various cities setting off fireworks, distributing sweets, and celebrating the news of the crash.
For the families of the victims of the 1988 massacres and the thousands of families shattered by the 2022 protest crackdowns, there was a palpable sense of relief, albeit tempered by the deep fear of the regime's next move.
It was a split-screen reality.
And the international reaction required a massive diplomatic tightrope. Condolences poured in from strategic allies like Russia and China, as well as the various regional proxy groups Iran funds.
Even nations that maintain highly complex adversarial relationships with Tehran, like India, and several Gulf Arab states, issued formal diplomatic sympathies according to international protocol.
But the United States and Israel adopted a noticeably blunt posture. The U.S. State Department issued standard official condolences, but immediately appended a statement explicitly reaffirming American support for the Iranian people struggling for fundamental human rights.
And the U.S. Defense Secretary categorically denied any American involvement or intelligence footprint in the crash.
Israeli officials utilized a mix of anonymous background quotes to reporters denying involvement, while prominent Israeli opposition politicians publicly stated they would not shed a single tear for the architect of regional terrorism.
But the most visceral international controversy played out at the United Nations.
The UN Security Council held a traditional minute of silence to honor the fallen head of state. It was a procedural norm that instantly mutated into a massive boycott.
Human rights organizations, alongside numerous U.S. and European diplomats, vehemently protested the gesture. They highlighted the profound hypocrisy of the world's premier diplomatic body honoring a man with a heavily documented history of crimes against humanity.
Amnesty International released a scathing statement demanding that Raisi's sudden death must not be allowed to deny the victims of his decades of human rights, abuses their fundamental right to historical accountability.
He essentially escaped earthly legal justice.
Mhm.
But his death transfers a monumental existential problem directly onto the shoulders of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
Khamenei had expended massive political capital over the course of a decade, clearing the board to position Raisi as his most powerful, reliable piece.
Raisi was the safe, deeply loyal, predictable mechanism designed to either succeed Khamenei directly or, at minimum, manage the turbulent transition of power to another hardliner without fracturing the state.
He was the ultimate insurance policy for the regime's long-term survival, and now that policy has been voided by a mountain. So where does the supreme leadership succession go from here?
It leaves a perilous, gaping void at the top of the power structure.
The Hudson Institute analysis points out that because Raisi and Khamenei were so thorough in their purification project, disqualifying and marginalizing every viable moderate or alternative hardline candidate, the field of potential successors is dangerously narrow.
Consequently, one of the few remaining powerful frontrunners is actually Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei.
But a hereditary transition, a father passing absolute power directly to his son, is an incredibly dangerous proposition for the Islamic Republic. I mean, the entire foundational mythology of the 1979 revolution was fought precisely to overthrow a hereditary monarchy.
It is the ultimate ideological contradiction.
Exactly.
If Khamenei attempts to maneuver his son into the supreme leadership, it risks completely shattering whatever remaining ideological legitimacy the regime retains among its core revolutionary base.
It exposes the system not as a divine Islamic republic, but as a standard corrupt autocracy.
Raisi's death didn't merely cause a temporary logistical hiccup in government operations. It removed the structural linchpin of the regime's long-term survival strategy.
It forced an impromptu, highly destabilizing reshaping of the entire Iranian political landscape at a moment when the country is already grappling with unprecedented internal dissent, severe economic degradation, and volatile external pressures.
It is truly a staggering historical arc to process.
We have traced the life of a man who began as a teenage seminary student in the cloisters of Qom, thrust into unimaginable prosecutorial power in his early 20s by the sheer gravity of a revolutionary vacuum.
We analyze its operation within the darkest, most secretive shadows of the 1988 prison massacres.
Examining the mechanical bureaucracy of death that earned him a reputation that would define him globally. We've watched him methodically weaponize the justice system to prune the political landscape of rivals, climbing to the peak of the presidency.
We explored how he oversaw the underground logistics of a resistance economy and the digital authoritarianism of brutal crackdowns, while shifting his nation's geopolitical axis toward global autocracies.
And then, at the absolute zenith of his consolidated power, poised to potentially inherit this supreme leadership of the state, his story is abruptly terminated in a freezing, foggy forest.
It really underscores a fundamental, unyielding truth about authoritarian systems. A state can spend billions to engineer the political landscape, disqualify opponents by decree, construct a sovereign intranet to control the flow of information, and monopolize the use of violence.
But the state cannot control every variable.
No, it can't.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to ponder. We've just spent this time exploring how an authoritarian state can meticulously design its own future over the course of decades, operating under the assumption of total control.
Total domination.
Yet, despite all that human design, the entire trajectory of a nation of 80 million people, and the delicate geopolitical balance of the broader Middle East was irrevocably altered by something as simple, ancient, and entirely uncontrollable as a wall of mountain fog.
It really puts things into perspective.
How fragile is the illusion of absolute power when it can be permanently grounded by the weather? And looking forward, as you observe global geopolitics, how will other heavily controlled political systems, whether in history or operating today, deal with the ultimate terrifying disruption of random, unavoidable chance?